Annie's.
because I haven't
That's
seen
how
you in
they
a while,
were.
even before the
Yeah,
semester
so
ended.
it's Annie. But I don't know. This is a
Did you go to
male,
Brazil?
which you can, yeah, whatever, or androgynous or something. Yeah. Okay. So, oh, join us.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
come and sit by us. No, I'm just going to introduce.
Okay.
We
Okay.
have it ready to go, and then
walk.
Oliver's going to do the Zoom, and then I'll just do the room. So,
Doing all right. How are you?
Sorry?
thank you for having us.
Of course,
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Including
really
Margie.
appreciate it.
She said she'll zoom in. She doesn't like coming to these events.
How many? Oh, we only have a few so far.
Yeah.
Are you going to the party tonight?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Are you?
Yeah.
You send it to her?
We'll catch up.
Yeah, exactly.
So how is she going to know?
Thank you for sending the links to the Gold War.
He's offloading some interesting responsibilities, like I'm going to be designing some assignments there this semester.
There he is.
Oh, Daniel. Oh, great.
Daniel would be a good person to
Do I convene us, or does Saul convene? I'll go ask Saul.
You will convene us.
Okay, all right. So do I convene us,
Are you
or
going
do you
to?
convene
This is
us?
what they're talking about right now.
Yeah, I think you.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
As a senator. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Visit the Southwest Virginia coal site.
I'm gonna take advantage of this lull and convene us. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm Christine Lebusky. Most of you know me. Well, some of you know me. I'm a faculty member in STS and also an affiliate in Aspect and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. WGS just became WGSS at Virginia Tech this semester. Very exciting. So on behalf of the rest of the series committee, which is Fernanda Rosa, and Lois Nguyen, who's not here right now, but is our grad student who's been helping to organize the series. I'm going to welcome us all and convene us for our first Friday afternoon seminar series, and we're welcoming Dr. Richard Hirsh from the Department of History. So I'm going to just do a bio and then turn it over to Richard, and then after the talk, as many of you know, we'll have Q&A, and we'll kind of move back and forth, Oliver and I, between asking questions from the folks that are on Zoom and asking questions of people that are in the room. I'll be moderating the room, and we have microphones that we will pass to you so you can ask a question. So, okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Richard, a professor of History of Technology and Science and Technology Studies at Virginia Tech. Richard Hirsh began his career writing about astronomy performed from outer space. This was published as Glimpsing an Invisible Universe in 1983. After working with a municipal utility system, reading this bio, I had to keep practicing municipal utility systems.
Say that 3 times quickly. Yes.
Richard turned his attention to the recent history of electric power networks, publishing first Technology and Transformation in the American Electric Utility Industry in 1989, and in 1999, Power Loss, The Origins of Deregulation and Restructuring in the American Electric Utility System. In an unusual twist, for someone who largely focuses on contemporary policy-oriented concerns, Richard then wrote Powering American Farms, The Overlooked Origins of Rural Electrification, which was published in 2022, and which reveals the relatively successful efforts to energize farms in the years before the federal government created the Rural Electrification Administration in 1935. In addition to his research, Richard teaches courses that cross-list between history and STS. At the undergraduate level, he typically teaches a 2-semester sequence in the history of technology. These courses provide an overview of the subject from prehistory to the Industrial Revolution in Part 1, and from the Industrial Revolution to modern times in Part 2. He usually teaches one of these courses in the fall semester of every year. He also and occasionally teaches undergraduate classes in the history of energy, historiography, and critical reading and analysis. At the graduate level, which may be more relevant for folks in this room, Richard teaches the History of Technology course, which deals with some of the major themes and readings emerging in the field between the late 1950s and the 2020s. To quote him, "It's a fun course in which I also stress the importance of writing short, well-written essays that avoid the use of the dull and inactive verb to be." Richard's academic background is somewhat unusual. He holds an MS in physics and a PhD in history of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his talk today is entitled "Blowing Smoke Up One's Ass, A History of Resuscitating the Apparently Dead." So please help me to provide him with a warm welcome.
Well, thanks, Christine, and thanks to the rest of you for coming this afternoon. This will be the first presentation of my research on this topic. I hope it's fun and interesting to you as it has been for me. I look forward to your comments after we get going, or after I finish talking, I suppose. Let me start by telling you a story of the grisly death of John Feeks, a Western Union lineman who had been electrocuted while working on a pole carrying scores of telegraph wires near New York City's City Hall. As reported by the Evening World newspaper on October 11, 1889, an electric line a few blocks away had accidentally crossed a telegraph wire and broke through its insulation, thereby sending a strong current through a telegraph wire that Feeks had touched. The lineman died quickly, reported the newspaper, in agony before the eyes of thousands. Entangled in the wires above the street for nearly an hour, he was seen with one of his rigid hands stuck in the air while the other clutched a wire and was burning. Onlookers could see the unfortunate fellow's mouth and nostrils belching forth white smoke. He was literally roasting to death, said the newspaper. Luridly, the report continued, a more thrilling sight was never seen in New York. Don't you love New Yorkers? You know, they really have a good sense of entertainment, right? The next day's paper observed that the lineman's pregnant wife was very low and grieving in bed while knowing that his unborn child would never know his father. So tragic and so apparently common was this accident that the city's mayor threatened action against electric companies in the city, which had seen at least 9 electrocution deaths since 1887. And here you see an editorial cartoon on the right urging New York's Mayor Hugh Grant to eliminate overhead wires in the city. That was something that was starting to occur, such that wires ended up underneath the streets instead of above them. Electrocutions of workmen and customers occurred not just in New York City, but elsewhere, going back to the early 1880s when electric power companies were just starting up. Here you can see some headlines from Chicago, Atlanta, New York. There were plenty of others. They illustrate that people were getting shocked by electricity on a fairly frequent basis. These electrocutions caused a practical and public relations problem for the new electric utility industry. On one hand, electricity was gaining popularity since its introduction in the early 1880s. It was used in factories and in homes. It was a hugely versatile service and product, and it enabled people to light up their homes and businesses without fears of fire because there was no combustion with electric lights. Most people didn't understand electricity and how it worked. It was viewed as a magical source that did so much and in a way that inspired awe, especially when it illuminated buildings at World's Fairs, as you can see here, and in big cities, as described by our friend STS collaborator from afar, historian David Nye. On the other hand, the electrocutions of electric workers and customers caused fear of electricity, a fear that wasn't helped by the so-called War of the Currents in the late 1880s between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. Edison was pushing his direct current system, trying to get popular acceptance of it. He was suggesting that alternating current was more dangerous. That was the type of current that was advocated by George Westinghouse. And Edison put on demonstrations in which they used alternating current to kill horses and other animals, suggesting that alternating current was not something that you wanted in your home or business. Edison also lobbied for and won the right to use, or not so much the right, but he won the case to have electrocutions of criminals done in New York State using alternating current, not direct current. The first execution occurred in 1890. So by the 1880s and early 1890s, an environment existed in which the new electric utility industry needed to find ways to emphasize the positive aspects of its new product and downplay fears about it. One approach consisted of publicizing and developing methods to resuscitate those who had apparently died from electrocution. I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I'll continue in a moment, but let me just tell you a little bit about what you're going to hear in the next 40 minutes or so. I'll offer a thumbnail sketch of the history of resuscitation techniques, going back to the 1700s and carrying the story into the 21st century. But I won't be presenting just a simple success story. Rather, I'll emphasize how people develop medical knowledge and describe its contingent nature. I'll also suggest that this narrative has value as a cautionary tale that can help medical practitioners develop a sense of humility about their work even today. And as a public service message, I am reminding you not to change light bulbs when you're standing in a puddle of water. That could be dangerous. Let me also tell you how I got into this topic. As Christine noted, I've been doing work on the electric power industry for several decades. And as I was going through some old industry journals, I found stories about committees set up to study ways to help people who had been electrocuted. And I thought, that's really cool. But that interest was magnified because I already have this background and long-standing interest in emergency medicine. I've been an emergency medical technician certified by Virginia since 1988. I work with the student-run rescue squad here at Tech, the Virginia Tech Rescue Squad. I'm also a CPR instructor, and I love working with the squad. I especially love training with the squad. You can see me in the picture on the right there. We did some ropes training, and that's me rappelling off the side of Lane Stadium, which, that's great fun. You can see me there in front of a helicopter that's used to transport patients. I'm not trained and certified to work on the helicopter, but we had a training about how to deliver patients to the helicopter. I have been a patient on a helicopter. That's another story. We can talk about that later. Anyway, let's get back to the story of how the nascent utility industry sought to deal with its difficulties in dealing with highly publicized electrical accidents. It did so in a multifaceted way. Of course, you can imagine the industry took a technical approach first, with professionals in the field disseminating knowledge on the best practices of wiring homes and businesses, for example. And you can see in the top there's a discussion as early as 1890 in a publication of the National Electric Light Association. It created electrical codes and standards that, for example, ensured that wires were properly insulated and installed properly in homes and businesses. There's a National Electric Code that was first published in 1897, and it gets updated every 3 years or so, even today. There were mandatory inspections, education about best practices, and so on. Additionally, and more important for my story, the industry also pursued educational campaigns to instruct people and to help others who had been electrocuted. Here you see instructions published in a major utility industry journal, the Electrical World, about using a technique to revive people, a technique that supposedly worked well for people who had drowned. This is the so-called Sylvester method, in which the raising of the arms expands the chest walls and allows for inspiration. When the arms are pushed down, the chest is compressed, supposedly forcing air out. The journal also published charts with instructions which were posted in power plants and elsewhere to inform workmen about this technique. And here's another set of instructions showing how to resuscitate people. On the left, you see this 1910 poster. In the right, you see a notice from 1929 encouraging people to learn the method, practice it, and use it. In their efforts to publicize the best resuscitation techniques, the utility industry drew on more than a century of work already performed on measures to bring the apparently dead back to life. They also brought together experts and provided training and funding for new work that would advance the state of the art in a way that would have practical and medical value, as well as public relations value. So if we look at this history, we'll see that more than 100 years earlier in Amsterdam, for example, there was a society that was created, the Society for the Recovery of Drowned Persons. And that the work that was done by that society, in which they published and gave rewards to people, published accounts of people who had saved others from drowning and even gave rewards to those people, that work was emulated in London, where you saw the creation of the Royal Humane Society. Again, the goal was to develop and understand the best ways to resuscitate people who had drowned, and also to give medals and cash rewards to people who had saved other people. And we see these societies emerging not just in the Netherlands and in London, but in lots of other places. You see societies even in America that do the same thing. And they would advocate, or they did advocate, the best techniques that they knew about for resuscitating people. One of those methods was the suspension method, in which, as you can read, designed for resuscitation from drowning because of a belief that lungs could be drained of water. But there were other techniques as well. This is the inflation technique. It was a form of artificial respiration that for a while was seen as a useful technique. And you can see some apparatus on the right side, some bellows that were used for blowing air into people's lungs. During the 19th century, people developed several other methods for simulating the use of muscles to bring air into and leave the lungs. There was an old-fashioned barrel method that apparently had been used by sailors for a long time, and then this Sylvester method that was used to simulate breathing, intake, output, inhalation, exhalation. Seemed like it worked. But one of the most popular methods was known as fumigation. As noted here, the Amsterdam Society recommended this technique as the most effectual method for reviving drowned victims. You did so by blowing strongly into the fundament, the smoke of tobacco, which its heat and irritating quality render more efficacious than just blowing air into the patient. Interestingly, even using a pipe would work. And here I use my first prop. Okay. If you didn't have bellows to blow smoke into, and a bellows and a pipe to blow smoke into the patient's fundament, and you happen to be smoking a pipe, Kara, you're enjoying this? No, I'm okay. You're smoking on your pipe, and you see someone who drowned. Well, you just go up, insert the end of the pipe backwards, put a napkin or a handkerchief over the bowl of the pipe, and blow in with the smoke going into the patient. Okay? Looking good. Okay. Here's another assertion about the efficacious nature of using tobacco smoke from 1775. As silly as this approach seems today, there was some good logic to believe that it might actually work. After all, tobacco had been known as a stimulant since its importation from the New World in the 1500s. It was also thought to be able to stimulate breathing somehow. The warmth of the smoke was also viewed as a positive feature since people were often resuscitated just by being warmed in houses and shelters. Furthermore, its use fit into the medical theory of the four humors, which goes back to ancient Greek medicine, but which was still considered valid in the late 18th century. In this view, the body was considered a small-scale representation of the world, with harmony maintained by the proper balance of the four elements or humors: phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. One way to obtain a good balance of these humors was to introduce stimulating warm vapor into the body, such as tobacco smoke. In London, the Royal Humane Society established several receiving houses staffed by medical assistants along the Thames River, to which people could bring apparently drowned victims for resuscitation. Kits like the one on the right for inflation and tobacco smoke enemas were placed along the river, similar to the way AEDs were placed or are placed in public buildings today. So if someone drowns, you bring that person to one of these receiving houses and you pump them up with tobacco smoke and things will look good. But the fumigation technique actually lost favor after some experiments on animals showed that nicotine in tobacco was toxic to the heart. And in fact, as early or as late as 1820, the Royal Humane Society put fumigation on the list of forbidden methods, a big reversal because for 50 years it was advocating the use of this technique to revive patients. But until the 1800s, again, fumigation and other techniques seem to have been exceptionally successful. Look at some of these statistics, especially from the early years, gleaned from records of both the Royal Humane Society and the Amsterdam Society. These show wonderful success rates using fumigation in the early period. For example, it shows that 44% of the patients who were treated with these techniques did not have successful outcomes. That meant 56.3% had successful outcomes, and that's pretty good. You'll see that the numbers on the right are, over time, fairly low, which suggest, again, fairly high positive outcomes. When I started reading some of these accounts, I began thinking about medical epistemology, the study of how people develop knowledge in the medical profession. I'm not the first person to do this type of thinking, obviously, but I was struck by how knowledge about resuscitation changed so often and so abruptly over time. In the half century from the 1770s to the 1820s, what was considered solid, incontrovertible standard of care with tobacco enemas, for example, became viewed as a life-threatening treatment. Such a change in position about treatment suggests, if nothing else, that medical knowledge is contingent, that it changes as people work in new contexts and gain different views about how the body works. So the replacement of the humoral theory of the body, along with some apparently convincing experiments about the toxicity of nicotine, caused people to abandon the fumigation approach only to adopt others and to disparage others still. You'll also see that inflation seemed to work well in the early periods, 1774 to 1778, but it was not widely used later, as I will discuss in just a minute or two. Besides fumigation, inflation, and warming, other techniques seem to work nicely to revive the apparently dead. Static electricity, for example, was thought to have a positive effect on reviving the dead. Now, people had been playing around with static electricity since the 1600s. There was a big uptick of interest in static electricity in the 1700s. We know of Benjamin Franklin doing work on static electricity and his lightning experiments in the 1850s. People also knew from early experiments that static charges affect animals and humans' nervous systems. And in fact, here we see a report from 1775 of a physician using electricity to revive a woman who had fallen out of a window and apparently died. She may have had a concussion, perhaps, and she could have had a concussion, she could have recovered on her own, but the claim is that the electric shock revived her after 20 minutes of being apparently dead. And here's another account from 1792, indicating that when all other resuscitation techniques failed, even after an hour or more of apparent death, one should try using a jolt of electricity. After all, electricity is one of the most powerful stimuli yet known. Enthusiasm about the medical use of electricity continued into the 19th century with the invention of current electricity in 1800. And here you see a depiction of experiments done by Giovanni Aldini in 1804 when he stimulated the muscles of a decapitated person's skull and other parts of his body. He was able to get the jaw to move, even though decapitated. Okay, you can imagine all this. Widely published and widely known. As somewhat of a side note, some scholars think that Aldini's experiments influenced Mary Shelley, who speculated that perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism or direct current electricity had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endowed with vital warmth. So there's a connection between electrical experiments of the time and literature of the time. And here's where I'm going to pick up the thread of the electric utility industry's involvement again. Even after the industry began publicizing the best ways to resuscitate people in the 1890s, its leaders made a more determined effort starting in 1911 by creating this Commission on Resuscitation from Electric Shock. It had some big-name institutions and individuals on the commission, such as representatives from the American Medical Association, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, from the National Electric Light Association. Elihu Thompson, one of the founders of GE, was on this committee. Arthur Kennelly, a professor of electrical engineering at Harvard. A lot of big names, to be sure, working to determine and publicize the best means of resuscitation possible, come up with mechanical adjuncts that could help with resuscitation, and they encouraged research on ways to restore regular heartbeats in people. And they published such things in journals. You've already seen some of the instructional cards and posters. They publicized what at the time was viewed as the most modern and effective means of resuscitating people, again drawing on lessons from people who had drowned. E.A. Schaefer in Scotland developed this so-called prone pressure technique in the early 1900s, with evidence suggesting the good movement of air even better than the Sylvester method and other methods that people had talked about in the early 19th century. At the same time, the industry continued promoting life-saving techniques, and it also rewarded people, and awarded people rather, medals and money to people who had saved other people's lives. The techniques used for resuscitating people dealt largely with trying to get patients to breathe again. And it's worth noting that people's hearts can still work even if they're not breathing. It's called respiratory arrest. But if there are no interventions, respiratory arrest leads inevitably to cardiac arrest because the heart is a muscle and it requires oxygen. If it's not getting oxygen, it's just going to stop working and the patient dies from cardiac arrest. So you need to get oxygen to the patient as well, as we now know. In the 19th century, people started learning more about how the heart works, with one important discovery that heart problems often occur due to fibrillation of the lower chambers of the heart. Fibrillation is the uncontrolled, irregular movement of the ventricle, the bottom parts of the heart. And if the ventricle is not operating the way it's supposed to, it doesn't pump blood to the body as it's supposed to. Now, back in the 1800s, they didn't have electrocardiograms like this, but I'm showing you this just to teach you a little bit about how the heart works so that you'll understand things that I'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. So in the upper picture, you can see a normal heart rhythm. You can see that familiar pattern that you see on TV medical shows, and that's the way you want the heart to work. On the bottom, you have ventricular fibrillation, in which you can see that the chart is all over the place. You don't have a regular heartbeat, and you are really in trouble. The patterns are, as noted, completely disorganized. There are no discernible regular wave patterns. This is incompatible with life, this says. A fancy way of saying, yeah, adios, you've had it. Okay. I'm sorry for using technical terms. Okay. For reasons that I haven't yet discovered, the New York Edison Company provided funds for research on restoring the lives of people who had been electrocuted. John Lieb, shown on the left, who was a president of the National Electric Light Association, certainly knew what his trade organization was doing in supporting life-saving research, but his company supplemented that work by funding several medical organizations, including the Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health in the mid-1920s. That group invited an electrical engineer, William Couenhoven, to work with it starting in 1928. And Couenhoven, with his colleagues, rediscovered that an electrical shock could sometimes restart the heart in animals. The group invented an early form of an electric defibrillator, a device that uses electricity to stop the fibrillation in the heart's ventricles, rediscovering what had been reported 30-some years earlier by French physicians. And I'm just wondering, there was a slide, I'm sorry, here I meant to point out that people were already learning and understanding about fibrillation and defibrillation. So as early as 1849, someone had already identified how the heart can go into this fibrillation and cause real problems. In 1889, there was a physician who was able to induce ventricular fibrillation in animals with electricity. That work was followed up by some French physicians who not only induced fibrillation, but they found that they could reverse fibrillation. They could defibrillate the patient, in this case a dog. They didn't understand how. They just knew that one shock caused fibrillation, another shock caused defibrillation. They didn't quite understand what was going on yet, and that research was largely forgotten soon thereafter. So you had this group at Johns Hopkins, including Couenhoven, who were doing research on fibrillation, electric shocks, and how they affected the heart. And they came up with a defibrillator. It was a big device. I'll show you some pictures. Well, I'll show you a picture of a smaller device. But it was a big device, and it was used successfully for the first time on a human being in 1947. And here you see a news item, a happy news item, about 14-year-old Richard Hayard, whose heart stopped during an operation. He wasn't having a heart operation, but a thoracic operation. His chest was opened up, and his heart stopped. And the doctors did manual compression to push some blood through the body. They also used drug, probably epinephrine, though it's not shown here in the caption. And they used an electric shock from this defibrillating machine that they had developed. Now, this was during open heart surgery. The operation worked very nicely. The heart started up again, and this was great, and people started using this type of defibrillation technique in the operating room when the chest was opened. Cohenhoven and others thought, oh, this would be nice, this could be used elsewhere, but of course, you're in the field, someone has a fibrillating heart, you're not going to slice them open, rip open the ribs, and then attach a defibrillator to that person. It would take a lot of time, and it's not something that could be done that easily. Into the 1950s and later, the utility industry provided more funds for research, in part because power company employees were still dying from electrocution. So if you look at this graph on the right, and you can see in the 1950s, a lot more people were getting electrocuted, people who worked in the electric utility industry, presumably because there was this post-war surge in construction of power plants, and there were a lot more people working in the industry. So even if a small percentage of those people were getting electrocuted, the numbers would still be going up. So the industry, again, in the 1950s, provided support in various ways for research being done on how to revive people who had been electrocuted and who were apparently dead. The Edison Electric Institute is the successor organization to the National Electric Light Association, and in 1953 it contracted with Johns Hopkins to develop a portable version of a portable version of a defibrillator, one that could be carried on utility trucks in case a utility workman had been electrocuted. And indeed, Hopkins, Cohenhoven, and others worked on such a device and came up in 1957 with this device here. It's an external defibrillator, meaning you didn't have to cut open the patient to defibrillate the heart. You could just put these paddles on a person's chest and induce an electric shock, which you hope would stop the fibrillating heart.
Richard, does this guy have a pipe as a backup?
Always have to be prepared for anything, any eventuality. You know, I never even thought of that, Lee. I'm going to use that the next time I give this talk. That is just too good.
It was Saul.
Oh, it was Saul? I'm sorry, Saul. Just brilliant. Yeah. How come I didn't see that? Yeah. Anyway, so they came up, they developed this portable external defibrillator and continued working on these things. The neat thing is that when they were working on this device and testing it on dogs, they found that when they pressed the pads, and I'm sorry, they had bigger, heavier pads in prototypes. When they pressed the pads against the dog's chest, they found that the dog's blood pressure increased. And they realized that they were actually pressing the chest and the heart and pushing blood through the body. That's pretty cool. Again, the blood seemed to be moving around inside, enhancing circulation. And it turns out that this observation, that pressure on the chest could cause an enhancement in circulation, that observation had actually been made several times before, with a report as early as 1878 that showed how pressure on the chest could boost blood pressure. And other people reported similar findings into the 20th century, but these reports didn't stir much interest in the medical community, and Cohenhoven and his colleagues effectively rediscovered this approach and did further experiments on dogs with better measurements to see if they could simulate cardiac massage without cutting open the chest. And indeed, they got some very good results with dogs, and they started applying these techniques on humans in hospitals, finding that they could maintain people alive long enough to get them defibrillated so that the heart would restart with a normal cardiac rhythm. In other words, chest compressions could augment the use of the defibrillator because they might bridge the precious minutes that utility workers needed to set up the new instrument. So the idea here was teach utility people this external cardiac massage and get the defibrillator to the patient as quickly as possible. When they tested this approach in hospitals, the first 20 patients they tested on, 14 of those patients regained good cardiac rhythm and survived. And they concluded in this 1960 paper, anyone, anywhere can now initiate cardiac resuscitative procedures. All that is needed are two hands. While Cohenhoven and his colleagues may have developed what we view today as the basis for modern CPR with the use of external compressions and an external defibrillator, it was still necessary to come up with a way to oxygenate patients, get oxygen into their lungs and then into the blood. As I noted earlier, there were several methods to do this, especially for drowning victims. But the methods described do not include positive pressure ventilation techniques, which is a fancy way of saying that you force air into lungs. Instead, they used negative pressure methods that simulated our regular breathing system, in which we expand our lungs. We have muscles, intercostal muscles, diaphragm muscles, expand the lungs. The pressure inside the lungs is lower than the atmospheric pressure. The atmosphere effectively pushes air into our lungs that way. During exhalation, we relax, and the muscles our lungs then push the air out. So inspiration is the active phase of breathing, exhalation otherwise, the reverse. But you would think, let's use this positive, or people thought, let's use this positive pressure method of pushing air in at higher pressure than the air is already in the lungs. And people had been doing this actually for a long time. In fact, there's a published report in 1744 showing how the use of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, mouth-to-mouth respiration, worked for a coal miner who had suffocated. He was pulled out of the mine and someone started blowing into his mouth, and after a few minutes the patient was revived. This sounds very modern indeed. This is something, as I'll point out, we are teaching these days in CPR classes, but very interestingly, this technique was quickly discounted. In the mid-1700s, scientists were discovering how gases existed within the air. And they discovered that oxygen was a separate gas, carbon dioxide was a separate gas, and that physiologically, we inhaled oxygen and we exhaled carbon dioxide. This scientific knowledge implied that that this mouth-to-mouth resuscitation technique clearly couldn't work, because we are exhaling carbon dioxide. That is poisonous to a person. We need to inhale oxygen, not carbon dioxide. So very quickly, the Royal Humane Society and other societies around the world said this mouth-to-mouth technique simply doesn't work and it should not be taught. So here we have what one could consider new science evolving, new knowledge evolving, but it also discounted the use of a technique which we later readopt. There were other reasons why you didn't want to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. During World War II, there were some studies that showed that mouth-to-mouth resuscitation actually had value. But there were other people, scientists, physicians, who were arguing, this mouth-to-mouth stuff doesn't really have value. In fact, this is from a book published in 1953 by a physician, Adventures in Artificial Respiration. If the victim happened to be a movie starlet looking exactly the way she looks in Technicolor, there probably would be a stampede among eager young male rescuers anxious to be of help. But if the victim were an old, dirty, bearded, drunken man lying in a gutter with his respiration stopped because of alcoholic poisoning, how many male or female lifesavers would be eager to touch with their lips the mustache and beard covered with vomitus? A real Samaritan might do it, but how many real Samaritans are among us? So there was clearly this yuck factor as well, again a technical term. And mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was not something you should do. Instead of using mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, people should use this negative pressure ventilation technique. This one is that Schaefer method, the prone pressure method. There were other methods that people came up with that were supposedly more effective, like this Nielsen approach, the back pressure arm lift approach that was being taught as a junior lifesaver in the late 1950s, early 60s, and Roger is nodding his head. I learned this technique. Okay, Roger, you too, it sounds like, right? Cool. The tide turned for mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in the late 1950s, though largely due to the work by Peter Safar and others in Baltimore, who were also working with Cohenhoven and the Johns Hopkins University folks to complement work on closed chest cardiac massage. They determined that mouth-to-mouth resuscitation or respiration works well, but you need to make sure that the airway is clear. Too often people would do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and the air wouldn't go into the lungs because the tongue blocked the airway or the trachea. So what Safar and others pointed out was that if you do this head tilt jaw thrust, I'll get it right, head tilt jaw lift method, you could make sure that the airway would remain open and you could get air into the lungs. But wait a second. Breathing carbon dioxide into a patient, into the lungs, has no value, right? Why would you do that? Well, people were beginning to realize, and Safar and others confirmed the fact that when we inhale air, we're inhaling atmospheric air that has 21% oxygen. When we exhale, we're actually exhaling 14 to 17% oxygen. Yes, we're exhaling carbon dioxide, but we're also exhaling oxygen. So when we are using mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as a respiratory technique, we are actually blowing oxygen into a patient's lungs. So there is some real value to do that. They published this work in 1958, and you can see one of the conclusions: forget about these back pressure arm lift methods and just do mouth-to-mouth as well. Whoops. I jumped ahead? Yeah. So by 1960 or so, the basics of modern CPR had come together, with compression of the chest to boost blood flow, mouth-to-mouth respiration to get oxygen into the blood, and the use of an external defibrillator to convert ventricular fibrillation. And these techniques gained traction pretty quickly, especially when they seemed to work in the hospital, and even with some EMTs in Baltimore who were adopting these new techniques. The National Academy of Sciences held a conference in 1966 on CPR, and they recommended training physicians in these new techniques. There was another conference in 1973. The American Heart Association, the American Red Cross also adopted these techniques and started training, teaching people, just lay people like us, how to do these new techniques. By 1977, 12 million Americans had been trained in CPR. I took a CPR class in the 70s with my girlfriend at the time. It was neat. I thought, man, I could actually do something. I could save someone's life. Let me summarize and start concluding. Accidental electrocution had become a big concern in the late 1800s as electric power became more popular and as companies provided electricity to the masses. There existed a long history of organized efforts to resuscitate people who had drowned and who had been electrocuted. Organizations like the Royal Humane Society contributed knowledge about resuscitation techniques. Utility companies and the industry trade organization provided financial support to institutions to do research on resuscitation. Such support and interest from physicians and others contributed to an understanding of how electricity affected the heart, and they then developed defibrillators and cardiac massage. Public health efforts expanded greatly after 1960 to popularize CPR and the use of AEDs later. So from one perspective, this history of resuscitation can be viewed as a wonderful success story, a narrative demonstrating progress and continuous achievements. Our story goes from the days when practitioners had silly ideas about how the body worked and crazy methods to revive patients to a period of enlightened scientists and engineers who used logic and experiment to develop modern life-saving techniques. This approach to understanding history follows a traditional and popular view in the history of medicine, exhibited in many venues, such as on the web pages of the American Heart Association and in articles that I found in the Encyclopedia Britannica. They explain that sound scientific thinking and advances in physics, chemistry, and the biological sciences were converging to form a rational scientific basis for every branch of clinical medicine, and that the 20th century produced such a plethora of discoveries and advances that in some ways the face of medicine changed out of all recognition. The way of looking at our story this way of looking at this story of resuscitation constitutes a form of Whig history, a form of analysis that emphasizes progress and enlightenment peaking at the present time. But let's look at this history in a different manner. Instead of being amused by the efforts of past practitioners and discounting their work, let's think of them as being serious and well-intentioned people who truly sought to advance the state of the art, just like people do today. When doing so, we realize that those who employed tobacco enemas, for example, believed that they had developed new and useful approaches to revive people. This perspective suggests, again, that medical knowledge was highly contingent and subject to social and cultural forces. A focus on contingency in medicine helps us understand, in a way that the Whig interpretation of continuous progress does not, why we see lots of fits and starts in the history of resuscitation. Ideas and approaches that in retrospect look good, but which were discounted or forgotten. For example, the successful use of mouth-to-mouth ventilation was published in the early 1700s and saw some use, but it was discounted when people learned that exhaled air contained poisonous carbon dioxide. It was also associated with this yuck factor even into the mid-20th century. Likewise, the use of external chest compressions as a way to pump blood and defibrillation was described in the late 1800s, only to be rediscovered in the 1950s and used as the basis of modern CPR. When we look at the history of resuscitation in a way that gives more attention to contingency than straightforward progress, we have the opportunity to examine what was considered knowledge and solid evidence, again getting into the realm of epistemology. We ask questions about the value of evidence and how to determine its legitimacy. The history of resuscitation teaches us, for example, to be quite careful of what is considered evidence. In the 18th century, the Royal Humane Society collected statistics on people who were revived after drowning with a lot of supposedly solid evidence showing that tobacco enemas worked, for example. The evidence made sense within the context of the time. Many physicians in the 18th century believed that the stimulative effect of tobacco could restore people's lives. Moreover, its use fit into a conceptual framework of the humoral theory of medicine, popular well into the early 19th century. Likewise, practitioners in the 19th and 20th centuries developed ways to ventilate patients with the Sylvester, Schaefer, and Nielsen methods that made great logical sense for simulating the action of the lungs, with some research suggesting they actually did that and worked, that they had some effect. But mouth-to-mouth or other positive pressure methods actually worked a lot better. I've had fun with this project so far because, among other things, my narrative can have value as a form of applied or engaged history in STS. It does so by providing lessons for medical practitioners in a manner that has been described by real historians of medicine. I'm just a newbie in the field. My story should inspire practitioners to act with more humility, realizing that their current knowledge should rarely be considered absolute and true. Even when they're using an approach known as evidence-based medicine, they generally need to know, more generally, they specifically need to know that they should remain open to different approaches. Now, I'm not the first to point this out and suggest that there are lessons for practitioners from the history of medicine. But more recently, and people have been doing this for up to 100 years, historians of medicine have been pointing this out for quite a long time. But more recently, some scholars have pointed out how medical students in particular often exhibit too much hubris and belief that they can employ good scientific principles to enhance the outcomes of their patients and advance medical progress. They think they can use this evidence-based medicine to treat patients in a manner that yields increased patient successes and the unimpeded march of progress. My story about resuscitation simply reiterates the notion that medical practitioners need to acknowledge more consciously the contingency of medical knowledge, that what we believe is clear-cut and true today may not be valid in the future. Even in my experience as an EMT, I've seen lots of changes in practice. And here I'm actually getting into a little bit of autoethnography. What was once accepted as scientifically proven has been discarded. This picture here is a picture of what I was trained on early in my career as an EMT. They're called military anti-shock trousers, MAST. And if you had a patient who was in shock, who was losing blood, you would put these pants on, pump up the pants such that there was pressure in the legs and the lower abdomen, and blood would be forced into the core organs around the heart and liver, and the patient would be better off. Well, after around 1900, this approach wasn't taught anymore. It was shown that this approach actually caused more trouble and more problems than it helped. So it went out. It went out as a normally used approach, and my young colleagues on the Tech Rescue Squad have never heard of these military anti-shock trousers. Even in the realm of CPR, things have changed over time, such as the compression ratio, the number of compressions to breaths. It started out with a 5-to-1 ratio, then 15-to-2, now 30-to-2. Moreover, if you took a CPR course before around 2015, you would have learned the ABC sequence: check airway, check breathing, start compressions. Now we use CAB, compressions first, and then airway checking and breathing. And even with these changes that supposedly lead to better outcomes, we need to remain humble. Though we think we know a lot about how to revive cardiac victims, we shouldn't get too complacent because we're still not saving everyone who's treated, even with the best, most sophisticated CPR techniques. A recent study, in fact, showed that the success rate of out-of-hospital uses of CPR is only about 10%. In other words, 90% of the patients who get CPR out of the hospital die. Now, that's better than a 100% failure rate, but it's still not as good as what you might have expected. So this presentation suggests that medical knowledge was and remains contingent, and that we must remain humble and careful about our use of evidence. We like to think that we're using evidence properly and employing the best clinical practices, but we need to realize that our knowledge may not always be as solid as we want it to be. That concludes the formal part of my talk. I don't want you to think, though, that even though I'm concerned that the average rate of success with CPR is only 10%, that it doesn't have value. Here I show a picture of Damar Hamlin, who in January 2023 was playing football, and he was struck in the chest. He suffered from what's known as commotio cordis, the incredibly bad timing of a chest compression in the wrong part of the cardiac cycle, and he went down, and his heart started fibrillating. Happily, within a few seconds, medical personnel got to him and started CPR and got an automated external defibrillator on him and revived him fairly quickly, got him out of that ventricular fibrillation. And that was great. He was playing football 10 months later. Okay, so my point is that even though the average numbers aren't great, it's important to get an AED to the patient as quickly as possible. You'll see AEDs all over the place. There are probably a couple in this building, though I don't know where they are. I know in Major Williams there's one. All over campus there are AEDs. But it turns out that many people are intimidated by these machines. They think you need specialized knowledge, specialized training to use them, and I'm going to show you that that's not the case. Getting an AED to a patient and using it can be incredibly effective. Data suggest that every minute you stall getting an AED to a patient means a 10% drop in the resuscitation of that patient, the successful resuscitation. So even if you're doing CPR on a patient immediately and you delay 5 minutes, 5 minutes to get the AED to the patient, you're reducing the survivability by 50%. So you want to get that AED to the patient and attach it really quickly. All over campus, again, you're going to see these AED boxes. I have here a training AED, not a real one, and I have a dummy here. This is not a real person. For those who are wondering, this is a simulator, and I just want to show you how easy it is to use an AED. Basically, you pull it out of the box and you open up the container. The first thing you do is you just turn it on.
Adult patient.
Oh.
If the patient is a child, press the child button.
Okay, it's an adult. Okay, now what do I do?
Remove clothing from the patient's chest.
Okay, it's talking to me.
Packet and apply pads
Okay,
onto
remove the
patient's bare
chest.
skin.
Okay, what did he say? Oh, remove
Pads as shown.
their
in the
pads and their pictures. Okay, so how do I do? Okay,
packet and apply pads
Okay.
onto patient's bare skin.
okay, put it on bare skin. Got it.
Pads firmly on skin.
Okay, and here this one
Apply
goes.
pads as shown in the picture. Press
Got-
pads firmly on
Okay,
skin.
I did it. Now what?
Do not touch the
Oh,
patient.
okay.
Analyzing heart rhythm.
Analyzing heart rhythm. Don't touch the
Do
patient.
not touch the patient.
Okay.
Analyzing heart rhythm.
Okay, okay,
Shock advised.
okay. What do I do next?
Do not touch the patient.
Not touching.
Everyone clear.
Clear. Everyone clear.
Press the flashing
Oh,
shock button.
press the button.
Shock delivered.
Shock delivered. Now what?
Begin CPR.
Oh, okay. CPR. And it even has a metronome telling me.
10,
10,
20,
20,
30.
30.
2 breath.
Give 2 breaths. I have a mask here. I head tilt, jaw lift. Then I do CPR again.
10,
10. And on and on and on. And it'll tell me when to stop at some point, or it'll tell me to check. Again, very easy. You don't need to know anything. It tells you everything you need to know. It doesn't say, this one just said start CPR. If you don't know what CPR means, okay, that's a little bit of a problem with this device, but it means compress the chest. Center of chest, cross the nipple line, press hard and firm. Okay, so the whole point of this was to demystify the use of these AEDs. You do not need specialized training. If someone goes down and can't be revived, and you're the first person there and other people come, you call 911. You get the AED. I start CPR. And of course, it doesn't hurt to take a CPR course as well and to learn all of this in greater detail. Thanks for your attention. This is a lot of fun for me, and I'm happy to take some questions from you folks. Okay. Bruce.
I think one of the things that you sort of brought together towards the end,
Hold on.
but I was a little thank you. One thing you brought together at the end in your comments, but I was a little unclear at going in, was something you treated in a humorous fashion, but it gets the question of how dead is dead, and who is dead.
Yeah.
And so where did the recognition of commonalities among causes of death say resuscitation was even a reasonable idea, and the techniques for attempting it followed?
Yeah, in the 1700s, people did, and much later, obviously, people were talking about when is the patient actually dead? When can you bury the patient, right? And there was a lot of discussion about this. Now, people had, one of the problems with the statistics from the Royal Humane Society, I think, deals with the fact that people would be presumed dead, but they really weren't. Okay, they may have been breathing, they may have had a heartbeat, but people couldn't detect that. They couldn't detect those signs. The stethoscope wasn't invented until the mid-19th century. Okay, and it's sometimes hard to tell if someone's breathing or if they have a heartbeat. They weren't checking pulses like we do today, checking the pulses in the neck. So there was a lot of discussion about when is the person actually dead. And there are reports, literally published reports, of people who were resuscitated after the patient was down for an hour, for 2 hours, for days. There's one report I read from Germany. Someone was resuscitated 14 days after he apparently died. Okay, that's pretty good. I think physicians today would be very happy with that type of outcome. So the whole idea of when is someone dead is still something that's debated. People who are on heart-lung machines, people are on heart-lung machines. When are they really dead? Is it at the end of brain activity? Certainly not when the heart stops, because we have ways of pushing blood and oxygen into a body without the heart. I actually know about that in January. I experienced that. I was on a heart-lung machine, just for the fun, for research purposes. Okay.
But again, I think that gets to the different causes of death.
Yeah.
That the resuscitation is supposed to deal with.
Right.
You emphasized drowning and then electrocution. Later on, you mentioned shock.
Yeah. Strangulation.
Right. And so where was the sort of correlative development of understanding of what would work for different conditions?
Yeah.
Because I could picture, for example, the barrel
Yeah.
might not have been good for one cause, but where is drowning like electrocution? Where is it different? I guess is what was the nature of the discovery?
Right.
In a pragmatic sense, at least.
Pragmatic sense, it didn't matter what the cause was. If the person wasn't breathing, you start doing these techniques. And you hope they work. I think, Matt, go for it.
I'm waiting until I'm on camera. Thank you, Richard. That was more thrilling than a New York electrical accident. I have two questions for you related to the wig history point, and one is about your title. This blowing smoke up your ass now has the meaning of, bullshitting or tricking you, and I'm wondering, is there a correlation there to how the loser knowledge was like over time, if there's any connection there. And that's really kind of just more of a curiosity question. The broader question is about the relationship between the technical solution and the regular practitioner solution, because where you really ended seemed to be the case that having access to this technological solution dramatically increased survivability, whereas better techniques had a really marginal gain in survivability. And I'm wondering if how the technological plays into your broader story.
Okay. First question. I did some research to try to find the origin of the modern understanding of blowing smoke up one's ass. I was not able to find a connection between the resuscitative techniques and that expression. Yeah, that was close to one of my first research questions. Just because, as you say. Okay, and if I understood the second question properly, you were asking about the use of technologies or hardware versus just no hardware and using manual techniques, or?
Correct, yeah, so like regular CPR versus having access to one of these new
right. Yeah.
solutions.
The way we teach it today is you do the manual stuff because that could, even plain old CPR can defibrillate the heart. Not very often, but it can happen. And I should also point out that there are other arrhythmias that occur that CPR and even an AED cannot handle. So an AED will not jumpstart everyone. Okay, there are about 60% of the arrhythmias that the AED can handle, but there still are some that can. So you start doing CPR, then you try to get the hardware to help. I know when I started doing CPR, we didn't have AEDs, so it was just this until the rescue squad came and they had AEDs. So again, I'm trying to figure out exactly what you're asking here, how the difference between using hardware and just doing it manually.
No. Sorry, just to clarify, it was more about in the kind of medical epistemology and in the context of the kind of wig history account. And the kind of debunking of the wig history account, how the technological developments play into that, because there it seems like you're finding
I see what you're saying.
Really dramatic breakthroughs, whereas you're not in a different context.
Very good. That's an interesting connection. Now I understand what you're saying. And one could argue that, with all this new technology, we are seeing this great progress. So indeed, to be sure, progress has been made. Okay, in medicine, it's not just, we're still not, we're not in the 1700s. Things have indeed improved, but things didn't improve necessarily in such a sequential, linear manner. Again, if people had paid attention to some of these discoveries made in the late 1890s, perhaps we would have had the hardware a lot earlier. Okay, but in the realm of medicine, in the realm of science, people discover things, they invent things, and then it's forgotten. So you have these fits and starts. Discounting the wig historical approach is nothing new at all, and I admit that. But I see where you're going. There seems to be sure, a lot more progress, at least the way I told this story today, once you get this fancy hardware in place.
Just one last thing. I imagine 50 years you could say, well, that's a problem because then nobody's going to be doing the manual thing and it's going to be costly. And, so I can see how it would get it messed up. I'm just thinking about the technological definition might add another
Right.
kind of research question.
That's nice. Thank you. Again, this is the first time I've ever presented this, my new research, and I'm still quite new into it. And indeed, on ambulances, we have devices that actually do the compression for us now. We do not need to be sitting there in the ambulance doing this all the time. There is a machine that does it, although there's some data suggesting that it may not be any better than when people do it manually. Okay. So, yes, Fernanda.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I had a couple of questions about the configuration of power in the history of this medical epistemology of resuscitation. And, and the ways that I was thinking about it is, this history arcs along, times of slavery, of imperial expansion. And, at that time, I'm assuming that and maybe this is bad to assume, but I'm assuming other cultural contexts have also developed understandings of resuscitation. And I imagine that there were likely interchanges, there's been a lot of work done on how Western medicine and knowledge benefited, from understandings from other kinds of places too. And so I was wondering if you looked into that. And the other part of it is, deciding who to resuscitate, allocates value to certain bodies and not others, or to experiment on certain bodies and not others. And so I was just thinking of the configuration of power. Thank you.
Lovely perspective. Thank you. I haven't done much on that yet, although I do know that this whole idea I do know that the tobacco enemas actually were, that was done by Native Americans using tobacco. Now, whether it was for resuscitating people or just for the stimulation that you get from tobacco, I'm not sure. Also in India, apparently, this technique was used, but I'm not sure how much, to be sure. But what a wonderful perspective, and one that I should pursue. That's great.
Hi. So, Mike. Oh.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I was curious more about the role of electricity and how, when you started this presentation, it was viewed as kind of like, the killer, and then later on there was just a switch to now this it's a part of the AED and it's now part of saving lives. So I was wondering if you had any more information about that or could speak to that more.
Electricity, even today, is presented, I think, in both ways. It enhances lives, but you got to be careful with it. Okay? I did not wear a T-shirt that was given to me which says, "Electricity kills. Be careful, kids." Okay? And you can still read flyers that come with your electric bill if you get your electric bill by mail that tells flyers that tell you, be careful around electricity. It can be very dangerous. So I think that dual understanding of electricity remains. It is incredibly versatile, incredibly powerful, incredibly desired, but there's, it's still kind of dangerous if you don't know what you're doing.
So I kind of wanted to ask about the cultural image of CPR. This, it's in a lot of movies, TV shows, the idea of, you have a doctor, giant paddle, rubs them together, clear, and, the patient is magically brought back to life. And I feel like that's a narrative I've seen in a lot of shows and movies. And I'm curious when that image of resuscitation became popular and how that's affected how resuscitation is kind of viewed by the average person.
Yeah, that's a delightful question because I like watching medical dramas, and you often see physicians, nurses, others using AEDs and others and other equipment and then shooting up with epinephrine. I read a statistic somewhere that the best place to go into cardiac arrest is on a TV studio stage, because if you do, there's a 60 to 80% chance you will be resuscitated. Okay, and that's, if you watch TV shows, the likelihood that you will survive is very high. Okay, in fact, it's a huge overestimate. I'm sorry, it's a very, very bad representation of what actually happens. But you're right, the general public watches this stuff, and people are going to think, of course, you know, if I'm in the hospital and my heart stops, great, they'll start it up again. It actually doesn't work that way. And that's another delightful element that I could pursue, you know, the cultural representation of this. Because again, you know, I remember when I learned CPR, and even when I teach CPR today, I don't tell people, hey, learn this, spend a few hours learning this, that's great. I don't tell people, oh, by the way, you're lucky if 1 out of 10 of the times you use this, you're going to save the patient. Okay, we don't tell people that there's a very high likelihood that the patient will die. Sometimes we do teach that, but I think most people who are taking CPR courses today think that if they know the technique, they will save the patient. That is not likely unless you have an AED quick at hand and you use it quickly. But again, that's only for the 60% or so of the heart arrhythmias that occur. That's still pretty good. Okay, and again, even 10% is a survival rate is better than 0%. So if you're ever with someone who is not moving, is unresponsive, hey, you know, Jerry, are you okay? Okay, then you check. Actually, if there's no response, you're going to start. You're going to check for a pulse, and then if there's no pulse, you start CPR. Okay, and have people, have someone else call 911 and get an AED. So, another good angle. This is wonderful. You know, again, I just started this research and having a lot of fun with it, and it's great to get these different perspectives and approaches. Thank you.
Saul, you're next, but is there anybody on Zoom yet? Okay, Saul.
Yeah, well, Andrew in some ways presaged my question, which is really about Stefan Timmerman's work. I don't know if you've engaged with that at all. It's been some time since I've read his book, but in some ways he's sort of working from Andrew's question, which is the kind of cultural representation of CPR and really playing with this sort of 10% success rate.
Right.
And I think asking questions about what CPR is doing for ideas of life and death, for ideas of medical intervention, and the kind of cultural and political role that CPR plays. And I was just wondering whether you've engaged with that and what your thinking is and how you sort of make sense of his kind of argument.
Yeah, I think. Well, I know I've read some of Timmerman's stuff, and if I am correct, he's arguing that sometimes it's not worth doing all this stuff. You know, you don't want to do CPR on people because, you know, he talked about 10% survival rate. About half of that 10% are cognitively impaired when they leave the hospital. They're alive, but they're not in great shape. And I've also read studies that, and maybe it's from Timmerman's, suggesting that physicians don't want to have CPR done on them because they know that there's a low probability that they will survive and be cognitively okay. So there is, I think, a good amount of discussion about whether all of this really makes sense. You know, do you really want to do this? On the other hand, I've met people who have been revived with CPR, and they're fine. They're happy to be around. Okay, so yeah, there are ethical issues to be sure around this. I don't know if does that get at it somewhat? We'll talk tonight.
Hi, Richard. I shared your talk title online, and you now have a whole new world of followers and fans. But I wanted to ask a historian question, which is, you play off a little bit your personal experience with these things, and you're kind of you mention it, but aren't talking about it as kind of something that might be influencing your methodology. And so I was curious to hear you talk about kind of how, because this isn't necessarily common with historians, right? That we explicitly talk about our personal experience and the ways that it might influence the questions that we're asking, or the methodology that we use, or the way that we're interpreting sources. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how your personal experience is shaping the way you're engaging with this project.
Yeah, that's good. Well, the personal experience is being an EMT and dealing with people who are injured or ill. Okay. And indeed, this I use the term autoethnography, right? Which is using my own experiences to inform the way I do my own research. And I see other people do it better than I do, certainly. By the way, Savannah Mandel is not here right now, but she just wrote a book in which deals with, in which she uses this autoethnographic research very nicely. Okay. One of the reasons I like being an EMT is because in a crisis medical situation, I may know what to do, okay? And I can help people. And that's very satisfying. How it informs my research on this topic, I'm still trying to figure it out, except for what I've already pointed out. I've seen how techniques that I was taught are no longer taught anymore. And things that I used to do, and that I still do, my younger colleagues just say, nah, we don't do that anymore. Okay. And that I find fascinating. I thought, you have all this data, you have all this evidence that shows that masked pants, for example, work well. They don't. Okay? Or new data come and suggest, no, they don't. But same thing with mouth-to-mouth respiration. It worked. It did work for a while, and then people viewed people thought, no, it doesn't work anymore, and then it works again. Okay, so again, this all gets into contingent nature of medical knowledge and so on. I'm still, I guess, working through this, and you're also making me think about how my own experience influences the research that I'm doing. I could tell you some stories, but leave it there.
I think I get to go next. I am so glad Saul's going to throw you a party tonight. So
wasn't that considerate?
So
amazing.
So nice of him.
It is.
So in 1968, I think that the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee meets on brain death, and this was sort of related to stuff that Bruce was bringing up. And I'm wondering if kind of a new medical consensus around what death is happening between 1966 and 1973 has any implications for the story that you're telling.
Yeah. If it does, I don't know yet. Okay. And you've just given me a new line of research to pursue.
And remember that party.
Remember that party. Saul, you want to tell us about it?
Wait, we have one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I'm also so glad that Saul bring out the parties, and so we can have more. We can extend the discussions.
And
so,
as far as I understand, I'm sorry to interrupt. After every seminar, Saul has an event.
Shout out to Saul,
which is so considerate. Right?
Oh yeah.
Thanks, Saul. Yeah. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks, Saul. But I'll just make my question short. But I'm so glad that you bring up some of the image of resuscitation and especially CPR on the newspapers, or how public discuss about these new life-saving techniques. So from the image that you present, they are like praise. You also have medals. You will receive some like human medal or something. But also another part of the CPR is that we need some good Samaritan because they are the yak factors. But also, but what come to me is that when I learning the CPR, this method, although it's outdated like 5 years ago, but another concern is that the legal lawsuit, or you might get sued if you apply this this method to the people, and they recover, or they may recover, and then you get sued because you kind of like violate some code, or they are not recovered, then you get through from their family or from their relatives. So I'm kind of like wondering about what's the either in the old days, like in the 80s or in the 19s, that what's the other side of
sort of the legal side of all this?
The legal side, or the content on the CPR, that does it cause some like a negative effect on the bodies, and then people don't.
And Richard, just before you answer, we have one more question after this.
Okay. So I'll be fast.
Well, just so you know, just so you know, there's one more.
Okay. So in the United States, pretty much every state has Good Samaritan laws. And when we teach CPR, we tell people that if you try to do some CPR and the patient doesn't survive, or if you happen to crack some ribs, the patient survives, but now there's liver damage, you are protected by laws, these Good Samaritan laws, so that if someone tries to sue you, the suit will not succeed. Okay, so that's the good news. As an EMT, I'm also protected by some state laws. Virginia Tech also gives me extra insurance, and all of us EMTs on the Virginia Tech Rescue Squad, such that we can be sued, but it's difficult to win those suits. But again, we have these laws, the Good Samaritan laws, that generally protect people who try to help someone else, even if the outcome is negative.
Hi. My question was similar to his, because we were discussing here with my friend. In our countries, we are not allowed to touch people, even if we want to, like we're willing to help someone survive. The laws are against any, unless it's the medical person.
Unless it's a medical
so
person.
that's why, but you just explained that now.
And indeed, at least in this country, and at least the way I was taught it, if someone is unconscious, if someone's conscious, I have to get that person's consent to help them. Okay, I come up to you, you're having trouble breathing or something, but you're conscious. I have to come up to you and I say, hi, I'm Richard, I work with the Tech Rescue Squad, can I help you? If you say no and I touch you, that's considered assault and battery, okay? And you could then sue me, okay? Now, if someone is unconscious, there's implied consent that the person would like to be treated. Again, in this country, at least, we don't have to be medical professionals to provide medical support. One of the great things I learned, that I discovered as an EMT, is that I don't have to be a physician, and yet I know stuff that can help save people's lives. That's amazing, amazing knowledge, and very satisfying, to be sure. But yeah, this is another great avenue to pursue avenue of research to pursue the way people in different countries are allowed or not allowed to help those who are in desperate need.
Thank you all so much. What a lively conversation. Thank you so much. Not deathly. So thank Richard so much. So much.
If anyone wants to come up afterwards and play with the AED trainer, this was not formal training. You can take CPR classes, learn how to do this in a more formal manner. Thank you.
And fantastic turnout. So I will just remark on that, and hope we see more of it, and we'll see you all tonight. So great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And by way of public service announcement, the AED box is down at the bottom of the ramp. You'll find other ones in this building near the double elevators.
Good. Good to know.
On each, at least on each public floor.
Thanks,
if
Bruce.
you're in the dean's office, that's in the hands of divine power.
And another announcement is that next week we have our Mullins lecture. So that's just another thing to have in mind next Friday at the same time.
Great.
I'll see you all tonight.
What time, Saul?
6 o'clock.
You know what though?